Okay, so let's talk a little bit more in depth about feminist pathways theory. So at the end of the last video, I said that these women who entered into the field of criminology, surrounding second wave feminism, got into the field, realized exactly what was lacking about existing theory and research, and some of those women, because they had found evidence of this blurred boundaries, sought out to create a new, more gender-specific theory. So from Malacot in Ireland, they say this theory seeks to use the historical context of women's and girls' lives to show how life events and traumas affect the likelihood to engage in crime. Within the feminist pathways approach, researchers have identified a cycle of violence for female offenders that begins with their own victimization and results with their involvement in offending behavior. So the research on feminist pathways theory really started with women using feminist methodology. And what that looked like, to kind of kick back to the first unit of the course, is very in-depth, qualitative studies where the researchers would essentially sit down with women who had been engaged in crime for probably quite a while and ask them, tell me about your life history research. A lot of the women who are participating in the research were actually incarcerated. So similar to how historically people went into prisons or went and sought out people who were engaged in crime for sure and studied them, this started out in a similar way. In part because of that fact, researchers started to review official records, records that are criminal justice system records, looking at court transcripts, looking at just arrest records, looking especially at prison intake records and other records within the prisons, to try to identify the extent to which these women's victimization histories were known to the prison, were known to the court, right? Did that stuff come into play during sentencing? Does the prison know about it? And are they doing anything about it in terms of treatment programming, counseling, those kinds of things? And so when researchers got a hold of the official records, then they were able to have, more quantitative data to go into building this theory. And from there, we have seen now data from longitudinal crime surveys be looked at through the lens of this theory. So I think it's important to state that the research base on this theory now has both qualitative and quantitative data going into it, and all coming from a variety of sources. The supplemental reading by Emily Salisbury that is up in D2L, Women's Pathways to Jail, that is an example of essentially using some mixed methods, because they were working with official records and reviewing those, but they also supplemented with their own survey. So, feminist pathways theory recognizes that each person's pathway to offending is different. It's similar to life course theory in that regard, and just like life course theory, both of these can account for strain, learning, social control, opportunity, and even, situational decision making or rational choice, all over the life course, playing different roles at different periods of time, right? Now, the key with both of these theories is that it looks for commonalities across all those different unique individuals. Why would they do that? Well, if we can identify a risk factor that's very common, or a pathway that's very common, then we can target that risk factor and try to implement programming or treatment that's going to reduce those risks, that's going to transform that into protection, or try to, interrupt that pathway, right? So it's not radically different from life course theory. It's more so that the research base tends to focus on some different questions. It also argues that some of these pathways are considered gender specific, which basically just means that the factors involved in that pathway are more important in predicting women's criminality than in men's, or it could be vice versa. In general, the two factors that this theory argues to be the most important are abuse victimization and relationship dysfunction. So in this slide, you're actually going to see a basic cycle that's meant to illustrate the blurred boundaries concept. This cycle, this figure that you see, is not hypothetical. Every factor that is represented here, every relationship that you see represented here with arrows, is there because quantitative research has established statistically significant relationships between all of these variables, and basically in the order that you see them. Okay, and of course qualitative research confirms that too. Really, qualitative research is where we first discovered the linkage, and the quantitative came along to sort of figure out exactly how things were related, how strong the factors are associated to each other, or how strong the relationships between the factors are. And so what we know is that abuse and neglect, neglect being a form of abuse, significantly increases risk that one will have family problems, right, that are somehow related to that abuse. Abuse and neglect also increases risk of emotional and cognitive issues that are going to later on potentially manifest themselves as mental health problems. We certainly know and are probably all aware of the tie between abuse victimization and substance use as a means of coping. And abuse and neglect also predicts academic failure, dropping out of school, but also just getting poor grades. Now, all of those factors are significant predictors of running away. And what happens when folks run away? Well, they've got to figure out how to support themselves, and so running away can lead to, increases the likelihood somebody will engage in prostitution or engage in drug and property offending as a means of being able to survive financially, right? Or an attempt at being able to survive financially. Now, abuse and neglect, disconnected family relationships, and all of these elements are also predictive of gang involvement for girls. And all of these factors here, this all applies to girls. When we look at boys, it wouldn't be that things are radically different, but we're not going to see that much prostitution on there. We're going to see less running away happening. We're going to see the strength of the relationship between different factors to be different as well. And we also know that abuse and neglect predicts violent offending as well. Now, the next thing that's important to remember about feminist pathways refers to the cyclical nature of all of this, right? Running away, gang involvement, violent offending, prostitution, basically being involved in crime is a risky business. And when you're involved in crime or delinquency, you expose yourself to new risk, right? New risk of being victimized because you're a member of the gang, right? Because you have money that you've obtained in an illegal way, and so someone might attack you for that. Prostitution carries its own risks as well. And so then you essentially have a situation where a pathway to offending has started with abuse and neglect, but that offending increased likelihood of later victimization that's related to that crime that you're engaged in. And then that can circle back and fuel pre-existing substance abuse issues, school problems, family problems, mental health problems, and that's the cyclical element. So, overall, the thing that you need to remember is the key issues. Mental health problems are more common among women engaged in crime and delinquency than men or boys. And of course, that has a little bit of something to do with we think men and boys aren't as likely as women to seek help for mental health problems. That's part of what's happening there. But we think also they're more likely to experience it due to the fact that victimization is so common. And substance abuse. All right, substance abuse is particularly high among imprisoned women, and that's more true for women than for men. Now, when we look at the supplemental reading again, the Pathways to Jail article, they spell out 3 different pathways, and they basically each fit into one of the 3 that you see here. Different scholars articulate slightly different pathways just based on what their particular data and sample are telling them. But for the most part, they're all going to fall into one of these categories. It starts with abuse victimization, or it starts with relationship dysfunction, family dysfunction more broadly, conflict within the family, right? If you think back to the risk factors for juvenile girls, family conflict is one of those. Family conflict, disagreement, arguing, things of that nature can take place without someone being physically or sexually abused, right? So that's the distinction between the two. And then there's there's always, an economic pathway. Social human capital is how it's referred to in the reading. But this pathway is basically one that's looking at and seeing crimes committed by women being due to their impoverished status, and often this is tied to their role as being the sole provider of their children.